Last night, Friday night, we did have a movie here entitled God Is Not Dead. If you've not seen it, it's a good movie, very, very entertaining. Thoroughly enjoyed it. As I mentioned Friday night, it does kind of wrap things up a little neater than usually how life does, but that's okay. Sometimes we like to see the real positive endings. Recently, I came across something entitled "A Touching Story: The Heart of a Musician and Maybe the Brain Also." And I'd like to read you this story that was relayed to me that I came across. It's about a musician. He said, "As a bagpiper, I play many gigs. Recently, I was asked by a funeral director to play at the graveside service of a homeless man. He had no family or friends, so the service was to be a proper cemetery in the Kentucky backcountry. As I was not familiar with the backwoods, I got lost. I finally arrived an hour late, and I saw the funeral guy had evidently gone, and the hearse was nowhere in sight. There were only the diggers and crew left, and they were eating lunch. I felt bad, and I apologized to the men for being late, and I went to the side of the grave, and I looked down, and the vault lid was already in place. I didn't know what else to do, so I started to play. The workers put down their lunches and began to gather around, and I played my heart and soul for this man with no family and friends, and I'd played like I'd never played before for this homeless man. And as I played Amazing Grace, the workers began to weep. They wept, and I wept, and we all wept together. When I finished, I packed up my bagpipe and started for my car with my head hung low, but my heart was full. As I opened the door to my car, I heard one of the workers say, "Never seen nothing like that before, and I've been putting in septic tanks for over 20 years." You know, there's nothing like a heartfelt message and it being the wrong audience. And today's topic of, does God really exist? You might think, well, here we are in this kind of worship setting, and majority of us here thinks God does exist, but I really don't think this is the wrong message for the wrong audience, especially in the culture in which we live in. We have drifted so far from our biblical moorings, the ideas that steadied this nation, and that were basically rooted in a firm foundation of good and evil, and those things we see shifting a little bit in our culture today. There was a time when we based so many things upon facts in our country. We based on our legal system. We based our system of justice. We based the value of human life. Our intrinsic worth was given to every human being based on an eternal perspective. And now we see that eternal perspective being eroded. We talk a lot about human rights today, but how can we really talk about human rights when we can't even come to a conclusion of what it means to be a human? So human life and sexuality, orientation and expression and marriage and those things today have been stripped of their sacredness. Now, those of us who ponder on the sacredness of things, we are looked at more and more in our society of being the obnoxious ones because of our definite values that we have. We live in a day and age of a new type of atheist, and I'll just label them as a new atheist this morning. And there are many of them, but three of the most popular today are these three guys: Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. And the reason these guys are so popular is because they have, within the last number of years, have written top-selling books, and so their name has come out. And so these guys have a new approach to atheism that we've not seen before. Used to, you could have somewhat of a civil dialogue between those who believed in a God and those who did not believe in a God. But this is a new form of atheism that's more militant in nature. They believe that not only does God not exist, they believe that all religious expression is evil, and if it's up to them, they'd like to see it eradicated from the face of the earth. And they believe that anybody that even considers the possibility of there being a God of existence, they consider people such as myself to be ignorant, to be imbeciles, and to be idiots, basically. And so they condemn a belief in God, and they think that agnosticism is even a cop-out. Now, not all atheists are of that same mold. An atheist and associate professor from Georgetown University, Jacques Berlin-Blau, said this. He goes, "Can an atheist or agnostic discuss any aspect of religion for more than 30 seconds without referring to the religious people as imbeciles, extremists, mental deficiencies, fascists, enemies of the common good, or irrationalists?" Apparently, guys like Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins doesn't think so. And so we find things like back in 1987 in Louisiana, the National Academy of Sciences rejected the idea of intelligent design being presented along with Darwinian evolution, which we had several years ago, even in our state, discussed, and was rejected. And the case was rejected based upon this argument. It says it fails to display, talking about intelligent design, the most basic characteristics of science, reliance upon materialistic explanations. So, in other words, it could not be presented at all because the idea of an intelligent design or a creation science carries with it the idea of their creative being. And if it's a creative being, then it's a supernatural being. It goes above the laws, the natural laws that we see in operation. And so, from the very beginning, the idea of a God in creation cannot be accepted because of God himself. So, when they look at the evidence, their mind is completely shut off to anything that operates in the realm of the supernatural because it's supernatural in nature. It's kind of like a guy that I read about that he announced to his wife one day. He said, "Honey, I'm dead." His wife said, "How can you be dead? You're talking to me and you're breathing." And he goes, "I'm sorry, honey, I'm dead. Who's to say that a dead man can't talk?" And this went on for days and went on for weeks. The wife got concerned, and finally she sent him to a psychiatrist. He laid him out on the couch, and he goes, "Well, what seems to be the problem?" And the gentleman on the couch said, "Well, I'm dead." He said, "You've got to be kidding." He said, you're talking to me. You know, dead people don't talk." And he began to explain the characteristics of dead people. They don't talk, they don't breathe, they don't, their heart doesn't beat, they don't bleed or whatever. And so he went into explanation scientifically about the processes of the heart and the blood circulation and blood pressure and all that stuff, and how it's not, physically possible for somebody to bleed and be dead. And finally the guy relented and said, "Well, I guess you're right." And the psychiatrist thought to themselves, "Aha." Opened his desk, he pulled out a pen, he poked him in the leg. Blood started coming out, and the guy that was laying on the couch looked at him and says, "Well, what do you know? Dead people do bleed." And there are some people, when it comes to looking at what I think is the evidence of the existence of a supreme being, they've got their minds so closed they cannot even consider the possibility of it. So the first thing I want us to talk about a little bit this morning is why not consider the evidence? Why not open the mind up just a little bit to think that there might be a supreme being? The psalmist, way back millennia ago, had to say this. Said, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge." Even the psalmist, many, many years ago, said, just look around. There's knowledge to be found. Now, the militant atheists would consider people like King David, who said that, as just the uneducated, an idiot. Well, listen to what this idiot had to say, a guy by the name of Sir Isaac Newton. He said, "The most elegant system of suns and planets could only arise from the purpose and sovereignty of an intelligent and mighty being. He rules them all as a sovereign Lord of all things." Walter Isaacson had a biography of Albert Einstein. He revealed that one time Albert was in Berlin and all the other scientists there assumed that he was an atheist. And this is what he said. He goes, "No, I have a deep feeling of faith, a deep religiosity that comes from my appreciation of the way the Lord made the universe." He said, and Albert explained that the way he looked at the universe was kind of like this library. He said, when I walk into a library, I see rows and rows of books, and he goes, and I assume that somebody wrote these books. I assume that somebody put them, in binders, and they got them organized, and, in the Dewey Decimal System. And he goes, when I walk into it, I see the design, and I see everything laid out perfectly, and I know that there was somebody, that there was an intelligence behind a library. And he says, when I look at the world in which I live in, Einstein said, he goes, I see order. I see beauty. And underlying his thought was the idea that the reason there is order is because there is an intelligent mind behind it. Isaac continued by saying this: in some ways, Einstein's belief in God, that God had created an orderly universe, it informed his science. And he believed that underlying everything, there are laws. And these two thoughts are coming from two of the most brilliant minds that have ever been born. And it's my hope this morning, if you're teetering on, is there a God, is not a God, I don't understand all these things, I hope that you'll open your mind a little bit to what I think is a reasonable argument for his existence. The second thing I'd like to mention is what is the cause of the natural world? Of course, there are some evidences of what caused it. The atheist claims that there is no cause, it just is. But for many people, this is kind of an unsatisfactory answer. There's nothing in our experience that indicates that everything just is. A theologian of many, many years ago, Thomas Aquinas, quoting back to Plato and Aristotle, developed the idea of a first cause, and that how everything that we experience in this world is contingent upon something else. Everything is dependent. Everything, has a definitive beginning, some kind of first cause. Well, what is it? What brought matter into being? And I've heard this from atheists myself, that, well, matter has always been. So they've got an eternal perspective on things. Think about it. They believe that matter is eternal. Okay, well, matter's eternal. Well, what caused the whatever to spark to bring this thing called life? How does life come from non-life? The atheists take a step of faith because they think it just happened. Don't know how. It just kind of happened. Where the theist, the person that believes in a God, takes that step of faith that thinks the evidence is pointing that the heavens declare that there's a being behind all of this. One looks for a natural explanation, and one does not limit themselves to just natural explanations. If I was to show you an apple this morning, my guess is there's probably not one person in here that would think that this apple just came into being. We would know that this apple came from something. We know that it came from this, an apple tree. Now, we don't see many of these down here, but we know that it comes from an apple tree. Well, when we look at the apple tree, we know that the apple tree just did not come into existence. We know this, that the apple tree came from apple seeds. And so we see there's a contingency, we see there's a dependency upon one thing to another, just like yourself that has, you're here because of your parents that were here because of their grandparents, their parents, and their parents, and you go right on down the line. There's nothing in our existence that indicates that it just is. Somebody had to create that first seed. Now, some people will say, well, the Bible is just so contradictory to science. Really? Really? And some people fail to acknowledge that sometimes the scriptures give us things that sometimes it takes us a while to figure out. Let's take Genesis chapter 1, which is one of the most scrutinized passages by those that do not believe in a supreme being. The Bible says this: in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And some people will come and say, well, what happened between verse 1 and verse 2? There was the heavens and the earth, and now the earth was formless and empty. And what was going on? What was happening between those two verses? Now, the thing that I want you to notice to begin with is that when we make this assumption many times, that when it says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, we assume that God says He created the entire universe. It's not what it says. That the word universe is not in there. As a matter of fact, the word universe is not in complete Old Testament at all. So what Genesis doesn't tell us, there are several clues and several other passages within the Scriptures that does tell us a little bit what was going on between verses 1 and verse 2. And it's the phrase, stretching the heavens. Stretching the heavens. And these are all the passages, and it's the Hebrew word natah, which ties into its stretching of whatever the subject is. So in these passages of Scriptures, it's talking about the heavens that are stretched. It wasn't until Albert Einstein came up with his theory of relativity, where it gave the idea that our universe is expanding, that we began to think about that our universe is not static and that it's just complete. And with the invention of the Hubble telescope and the scientists that put that into orbit, we're able to look, and while we are sitting here this morning, our universe is still expanding. Thousands of years before we discovered that, God's Word told us that He stretched and is still stretching the heavens. The great scientist, American scientist, Robert Jastrow, who was the head of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space, he says this, which is very interesting. And he wrote this in his book, God and the Astronomers. He said, scientists, he goes, I'm afraid this whole thing is going to end like a bad dream. We're going to scale the mountains of knowledge and climb higher and higher, and we're going to climb up to the top and meet a bunch of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. This brings us to another question. This is from an astrophysicist. This brings us to another question. Where did the design of the world come from? One of the greatest things that you can look at, and that's so close to you, it's sitting in your seat, look at your human body. You are an amazing creation. You are an amazing machine. Do you know that today your heart will beat about 103,000 times? That you will breathe over 23,000 times? You will inhale 438 cubic feet of air. You will eat, before this day is over with, about 3 pounds of food. You will drink almost 3 pounds of liquid. You will perspire 1.43 pints. That's nasty, isn't it? You will give off 85.3 degrees of heat, which generates about 450 tons of energy. You will speak over 4,000 words. For you ladies, scientifically, you will speak much more than that. And I'm just giving you the facts. You will move 750 major muscles. Your fingernails and toenails will grow 0.01714 inches. And you will exercise 7 million brain cells. Now you know why you're so tired at the end of every day, don't you? One of the greatest human things that you can look at is human birth. Do you know that before you were born, while you were in your mother's womb, that, for us as adults, there's a part of the heart that lets the blood into the heart that the lungs have put oxygen in, and then it sends it out, to the lungs to get more oxygen, and we got our circulatory system that takes place. But in an infant in the womb, it doesn't do that because the mother provides pure blood. But at the moment of birth, there's this muscle that goes into effect. How many millions of years did it take for that to develop? Take the human eye. The human eye has over 40 different functioning parts. If just one does not work, you won't be able to see. There's 11 different layers. There are blood veins, and there's all kind of things within the eyeball and the retina and other things that takes in the light, and it disseminates all the different colors that causes you to have the ability to be able to see. Well, how did creatures live for millions of years before they evolved eyes? Even Charles Darwin struggled with this a little bit. He said this. He goes, suppose that the eye with all the imitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Now, I'm not saying that he didn't try to explain that according to his theory, but he was intellectually honest enough to say, you know what, there's some holes in my thinking. For over 50 years, there was the most famous atheist in the world was a guy by the name of Antony Flew. He was from England, and he spent 50 years teaching why there was not a supreme being. And he died about 4 years ago. But before he died, near the end of his life, this is what he had to say.
There's hidden mechanisms of that world which are progressively revealed by the advance of science.
But now it is the advancement of science itself that has changed the mind of Flew and some scientists. At a recent summit at New York University, Flew changed his position and now believes in God as the creator of the universe.
It is all a matter of the enormous complexity by which the results were achieved, which looked to me like the work of intelligence.
To discuss the point.
Another scientist has said, you know what, the more I think about this, the more I just study it, the more just some of the things that we've just been inundated with, it just doesn't add up. The Bible says the heavens declares the glory of God. Another question that I've never heard adequately explained by somebody who does not believe in a supreme being is this question. Where does humanity derive its morality? Now, this doesn't prove the existence of God, but it does beg some very important questions that we've got to ask. Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived from 1844 to 1900, a brilliant mind, died at the age of 56, an atheist, a genius. It's kind of interesting that his father and both of his grandfathers were ministers, but somewhere along the way in his study of philosophy, he lost his faith in God. And he's the guy that first coined the phrase, God is dead, that became popularized. And he said that because God is dead back in the 19th century, there was going to a couple things he predicted it was going to happen. He said, first of all, in the 20th century, we were going to experience the bloodiest century in the history of humanity, which turned out to be true. There was a study that was done back in the 1970s that with World War I, World War II, and Korean and Vietnam, more people died, in the 20th century than the other 19 centuries combined. And the second thing that he said is that there would be a universal madness that would break out, which is kind of interesting because he spent the last 13 years of his life insane, where he'd spend weeks and weeks and weeks in bed in silence. But in a more clearing thinking time in his life, he wrote this, and this is really powerful. This is from Friedrich Nietzsche. He said, have you not heard of the madman who lit a lantern in the morning hours and ran to the market and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God, they were standing together there, and he excited considerable laughter from them. Have you lost him? Said one. Maybe God's lost his way like a child, said another. Maybe he's hiding. Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or immigrated? So they shouted and laughed him to scorn, but the madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. Where is God? He cried. I'll tell you where we have killed him. You and I, we all are his murderers, but now how have we done this? How are we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? Where do we go what do we do when we unchain the earth from its sun? Whither is this earth moving now? Whither are we moving now away from all suns? Are we not perpetually falling backwards, forwards, sideways, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not strained to an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not suddenly become colder? Is not more and more night coming on us all the time? Must not lanterns now have to be lit in the morning hours? Do we not hear anything yet of the noble of the grave diggers who are burying God, of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? God's decomposed too, you know. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. Now, how shall we, the murderers of all murderers, compose ourselves? Because that which was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water can we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games will we need to invent? Is not this greatest of all deeds ever done, and maybe to be too great for us to handle? Must not we ourselves now become God simply to seem worthy of what we have done? There's never been a greater deed, you know, and whoever shall be born after us for the sake of this deed will be part of a different history than all other history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent, and again regarded his listeners. They too were silent, and they stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground, and it broke and it went out. I've come too early, maybe. My time has not yet come. It has been related that further on that same day, this madman entered diverse churches, and there sang a requiem aeternam Deo that he let out and quieted, he said, to have retorted each time. What are these churches now if they are not the tomb and the sepulchres of a dead God? God is dead. We have killed him. Did you notice the questions that Friedrich Nietzsche asked? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away creation? Don't we suddenly need lanterns in the morning hours? What he's really saying is we've lost the idea of a transcendent being that we are dependent upon. We have lost the one that gives the definition of life. We have lost the one that has the right and the only right to say what is right and what is wrong. What it means to be a human. The irony is that what Nietzsche wrote, Adolf Hitler got his hands on, and he personally delivered it to Mussolini and to Stalin, which taught that there really is no such thing as the equality of all races. Nietzsche gave Hitler the depth of the idea of that if God is dead, then we've got to come up with our own definitions of what really it means to be a human, what it means to be good or what it means to be wicked. At least Nietzsche knew the ramifications of his thought, and it disturbed him deeply. And the likes of a Richard Dawkins, the likes of a Sam Harris, the likes of a Christopher Hitchens, they are in preschool compared to the mind of a man like Nietzsche. Even good reasoning cannot produce morality. Even the best mental gymnastics does not give a justification of right or what is wrong. Only a transcendent God has the authority and the right to say what is right and what is wrong. One place that I'll never forget as long as I live was a trip that my family and I made several years ago to Poland on a 2-week mission trip. And in Poland, we went to a place called Auschwitz. And I don't know that there's a way that you can emotionally prepare yourself for a place of untold horror and death like in Auschwitz. Where thousands, at the height, 12,000 people a day, 12,000 people a day were put to death within the ovens and the gas chambers of Auschwitz at the hands of the Nazi people, soldiers. And as you go through Auschwitz, they'll take you on a tour, and you'll go into these different buildings. And in one of the buildings, there are plates of glass and things, remnants of this period of time back in the 40s. And this picture is a picture of 14,000 pounds of human female hair. And what they did is they would bring the women in and they'd shave their heads and they would tell them that they were going to give them a shower, and they'd put them into these chambers, and they, with the idea that these showers, but instead the pellets would be dropped in that would kill all these women. Untold horror. Can't imagine that. And the real emotional part, and you can ask my wife about this is where I saw her emotionally lose it, is there's another section where it's about the children of Auschwitz. And you'll go and you'll see baby shoes and clothes and stuff, and you wonder, how can a human mind ever get to the point of killing children, innocent children? How could a guy not, like Joseph Mengele, the German, there's pictures, and I didn't want to show you these, of little boys that have been castrated for experiments. And just before one of the oven rooms, there are the words of Adolf Hitler. It says, "I want to raise a generation devoid of conscience, imperious, relentless, and cruel." When atheism is carried to its logical conclusion, there is no foundation for value. You might have a good friend that's an atheist, that's a good person, and that's great. But to be honest, there is no rationally compelling reason for the morality other than pure pragmatism. Jeffrey Dahmer, that we are very familiar with, killed 17 men and ate them. Right before his execution, he asked this question: if man is a product of blind chance and there is no God and there is no meaning, then who are you to tell me what is right or wrong? We're repulsed at a guy like this. But with where we have come as a culture, where we have removed God out of everything that we can possibly be removed from, why are we surprised when crazy people go into schools and shoot children? Why are we surprised when people go on a rampage and loot and steal and burn just because there's a decision that's been made they don't agree with? Why are we surprised when we find child abuse and sex trafficking and all these things? This is the natural result of a society that says there is no God. Even Richard Dawkins once commented, he goes, "I wonder if there is such a thing as evil." You see, when you believe in a God, you believe in a moral law that transcends above humanity. We argue that God is the one that gives the authority over to what is right and what is wrong. Atheism is a belief system. It believes that the world exists and is ordered and is noble. It believes our intellect is reliable in discovering truth. It believes in the uniformity in nature from the past to the future. And you know what? We believe the same exact thing. Is that we just believe in a God. Near the end of his life, atheist Jean-Paul Sartre said this to his friend Pierre Victor. He goes, "I do not feel that I am the product of chance, a speck of dust in the universe, but someone who was expected, prepared, and prefigured." There was even something within this atheist that says, it just seems like there's more to this universe than what I've often thought. And you can build the most magnificent building in the world, but if it doesn't have a strong foundation, it's going to crumble. It's important, if you are a believer in God, to teach your family about that foundation. There's not a price tag that I can put on that brings me any greater joy in my life right now than when I'm with my family and we're sitting around a table and I hear one of my children utter a prayer of thanksgiving to God. There's nothing more important to me than that. And there's nothing more important that you can do for your family. One day there was a guy that came to Jesus, and he was wanting to trap Jesus, and they were always trying to do that to Jesus. And this guy came up to Jesus, and he said, "Jesus," he said, "should we pay taxes to the Roman government?" See, what he was doing is that he knew that if Jesus said, "Yeah, pay taxes," all the Jewish people would turn on him. And if he said no, then he knew that, that the Roman government would, jump on Jesus. So it was, it's kind of a clever setup for Jesus. And so Jesus looks at that guy and he says, I tell you what, he goes, do you have a coin on you? This guy, I'm sure he reaches into his pouch and he hands Jesus this coin. And could have been one just like this, because this coin is from the first century in which Jesus lived. And Jesus looked at that coin and he said, on whose image do you see on that coin? And that guy said, well, I see Caesar's image. Well, Jesus said, well, then you give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and you give to God what is God's. Now, the reason that I know this guy was not sincere, first of all, the scriptures tell us. And secondly, if he was really sincere in this question, you know what he would have asked? Well, what is God's? But he doesn't ask that question. But if he had have asked that question, I think what Jesus might have said is, well, whose image is on you? The greatest compliment that Jesus pays to you and he pays to me is that we have been created in the image of God. Now, the atheist will deny that. So which way do you want to go? Eternal matter plus chance plus time, which ultimately ends up in your extinction? Or in the idea that, yeah, there is eternal things, but that eternal thing is God that has created me. If you are wondering about a relationship, you're wondering if this God stuff is for real, I'd like to encourage you to just take the Gospel of John and take some time and some quiet and solitude and read about not what you've heard on television or in social media outlets, but read for yourself about Jesus and what the Bible has to say. God's not dead, and he's surely alive, and he's living on the inside for those that will turn to him.